Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 306 of the Mediaeval podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. Part of the reason a lot of people figure nothing much went on during the Middle Ages is because we've lost a whole lot of sources telling us what actually did happen. Through malice or misfortune, sometimes both at the same time, manuscripts have been destroyed in their thousands. So how do we know what may have gone up in smoke? And what can we do to keep our beloved manuscripts safe? This week, I spoke with Dr. Robert Bartlett about the many manuscripts we've lost by accident and by design. Robert is Professor Emeritus at the University of St. Andrews and the author of many books, including the Wolfson Literary Prize-winning The Making of Europe, Conquest, Colonization, and Cultural Change. Eagle-eyed history buffs will also have seen him on several BBC series, including Inside the Medieval Mind, The Normans, and The Plantagenets. His new book is History in Flames, The Destruction and Survival of Medieval Manuscripts. Our conversation on what we've lost, some truly spectacular moments of destruction, and how our precious documents are being preserved today is coming up right after this. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for coming to speak to us about History in Flames. It is such a pleasure to meet you. You have an incredible resume. I hope people will learn more about your work after this. But for now, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So you've just written a book about History in Flames, the destruction of manuscripts. Why did you think it was important to write about how they're disappearing rather than the ones that we still have?
I think it's important when people consider the past to realize that the evidence is not complete. What we have is a very small sample of the evidence of the past. And people could presume that we know the past, but I don't think we do know the past. I think it's more precarious than that. And it's particularly true of the medieval period, because in the medieval period, as you know, the written evidence is all manuscript. It's all written by hand. It's prior to printing. So sometimes very important texts survive only in one manuscript, and they might not survive. And we certainly don't have even a tiny fraction of what was written in the Middle Ages. So it's the precariousness of the past, making people aware that we haven't got a straightforward textbook account of what happened, not just in the medieval period, but also in the modern period too. And we need to approach it critically. And one of the things we've got to be critical about is what evidence is there? And how does that evidence survive? And where does it survive? Why do we know? How can you know things that happened 800 years ago? Yeah? I mean, where do you start? And what things have been selected? And was there a principle of selection? What things have been lost? And that's tricky, of course, because you're trying to then talk about what doesn't exist. It's quite hard to talk about what doesn't exist, but you can try. And an example I give is Beowulf. And I think if anyone has ever heard of a medieval poem, the chances are it's Beowulf, because, of course, it's been made into films, it's been made into video games, it's been translated hundreds of times. It survives in one manuscript, and that one manuscript was not read, as far as we know. There's no evidence of it being read before the Tudor period, when someone who's reading it writes his name on it. So that's how we know one person read it. And there's no evidence of it going, it doesn't go into print. It's not copied until we get up to the 18th century. In the 18th century, it's in a library, the Cottonian Library, the library owned by Sir Robert Cotton, which is why it's called that. And in 1731, there's a fire in the library. And just by pure chance, many, many things were destroyed. Many things, hundreds of manuscripts were destroyed. But Beowulf survives, just a little charred, a little bit, the binding went, and there's a bit kind of charred on the edges. And that's what survived. And that still wasn't printed for another 30 or 40 years. So that just kind of comes through by the merest fluke. We'd have no knowledge whatsoever of Beowulf if that hadn't happened. And then, of course, once it survives, once it gets into the time of print, then the printed copy can multiply, greatly. And we're through, and we've got Beowulf as we know it. But how many other books, how many other poems, how many other texts didn't make it through? That's one thing one should think about.
Yes. Well, this is one of the reasons why I didn't become an Anglo-Saxonist, because it's too hard. There aren't enough papers. So I love the 14th century, but even then, Sir Gawain nearly didn't make it either. So yeah, it's all about chance. So one of the things that you do at the beginning of the book is look through the ways people have tried to calculate how much is missing. So what did you learn from looking into what's not there?
I think I learned the narrow chance that some of the texts have of coming through. If you're talking about Western Europe and the tradition of culture, most of the Latin classics, they certainly don't survive in texts from the ancient Roman period. They survive in texts copied out. They survive in copies made in the medieval period, and in particular in the Carolingian period, the 9th century, when for some reason there was a real concentration on copying out these texts. And so we can get a list of things produced in the Roman period. We can get a list of the things that survive now, and we have a huge chunk that has disappeared. If you go back to the Greeks, it's even greater. So we're talking about, say, the great Athenian dramatists, like Aeschylus and these people. And if you look at that, you can say roughly that 90% of their plays have disappeared. So that's what you've got to take into account. And of course, you concentrate on what survived for very good reason. But you've always got to say to yourself, okay, how would the picture be different if the 90% hadn't disappeared, if we could put that 90% into the picture? And that, of course, is largely hypothetical, but you can try. And then you look at production, how many manuscripts were being produced. And you have to be a little bit skeptical of people who try and say there were 10 million manuscripts written in the Middle Ages, right? It's all a bit figures conjured up from the blue, But there obviously was some total figure in the mind of God, he would know. And you've got clear evidence that the amount of stuff that is being written increases over the course of the Middle Ages rather dramatically. So you've got the ability. You've just mentioned the case of the 14th century compared with the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, you can put all the written evidence for Anglo-Saxon England on one big table easily. The 14th century, you can't read it in a lifetime. You can't read it in a dozen lifetimes, right? So there's been a complete change in the amount of material being produced. So that's one thing, the production. And in the book, I talk about the conditions of production. I talk about what did they write on and how many scribes were there and how fast do medieval scribes write, things like this. So this is the production level. And then you've got the destruction level. And that's one of the things I concentrate on. And in what circumstances is there destruction? And is the destruction random or is it complete? Is it ever controlled? I contrast the dissolution of the monasteries in England, which was chaotic and resulted in probably 85% of the monastic libraries disappearing. And you can sort of sometimes find fragments and things, they find things like pages of medieval books used for wrapping butter and stuff like that. It's kind of very dramatic. And then later, in the Napoleonic period, a large number of monasteries were closed down in Bavaria, in southern Germany. And that was done with a kind of controlled and careful process. Where should these books go? They had a committee in charge of it. They divided up the categories of books. And there you'll find that the medieval libraries went more or less intact into the State Library of Bavaria, which is still there. You can still go to Munich and you can still see all these hundreds of books from these medieval libraries. So that's one of the more complete things. So the conditions under which things survive. And I talk quite a lot, of course, about the history of libraries and archives and when they began, because some of them have an enormous continuity. The archive of the Crown of Aragon, which is in Barcelona, has a continuous history from the 14th century up to the present day. And that's rare, very rare. But then, of course, you've got archives that are destroyed, which is one of the things I talk about in the book.
Yes. And one of the things that you take time to pull apart is the difference between a library and an archive. So can you tell us what the difference is and what is kept in these things?
Put very simply, a library is where you have books and an archive is where you have documents. And that's an oversimplification, but it's a good starting point. And you'll find nowadays in modern European cities and in elsewhere in the world, but I'm talking about medieval Europe, you'll always find things like the British Library, which is full of books. And a little bit out of London in Kew, there's the National Archives. And for one kind of thing, you'll go to one, and one kind of thing, you go to the other. In London, you have to take an underground train from one to the other. But in places like Paris and Rome, the archives and the libraries are very close to each other, which is much more convenient. So you've got basically somewhere you go to have books, and those books, some of them might be practical books, they might be administrative, but for the most part, they are books with texts, with maybe theology, maybe history, all sorts of things. And the administrative stuff is the archive that is produced by the workings of government. And that means that the survival of it is rather different, because when you've got a day-to-day government, you need administrative documents. But when the document is 10 years old, or when the document is 20 years old, do you need it anymore? It's taking up space, right? Mm-hmm. The example I give is the very oldest letter written in English, in Old English, which is from the 10th century, I think. And it survives in Canterbury Cathedral Archive. And it's a very short letter, but it's been sitting there on the shelf for 1,000 years. In the 12th century, a Canterbury Cathedral monk went and had a look at it, and he wrote on the back, "Useless." That is, it's no longer got any relevance. On the other hand, he didn't say useless and throw it out, right? He kept it there. And at some point, it may be the case that someone says, okay, this stuff is hopelessly out of date, but we'll keep it for historical purposes. And that's one of the things that's very important for archives. And so you've got continuity of archives, discontinuity of archives, the difference between archives and libraries, of course, depending on what kind of books they have in them, because people value certain books and not others. When the French Revolution came along, the monasteries were all closed down and became property of the state. And the value of what was in them, lots of people thought, we can get rid of the lot, right? And there were bonfires of books. In fact, my opening example in the book, The History in Flames, is of a bonfire in Paris during the French Revolution when hundreds of manuscripts were destroyed. And they obviously thought, what is this stuff? This is a collection a man had made which showed the ancestry of the nobles. They didn't care about the ancestry of the nobles, right? Yeah. Burn the lot. So that's the difference between archives and libraries, putting it very generally.
Right. Well, maybe it's time to start getting into destruction, because when it comes to libraries and archives, there might be different reasons to destroy them. Sometimes this is intentional, sometimes it's accidental. So there's one medieval example in the book that I can think of, and that is the Peasants' Revolt. And this is a targeted attack on documents. So let's get into this medieval example. What happened during the Peasants' Revolt?
There was a definite attack on documents of all kinds. In Cambridge, which is a very well-attested example, the crowds, the rebels sacked the colleges and took their title deeds and their documents. They regarded the colleges, with probably fairly good reason, as oppressive landlords. And they wanted to smash the lot. And they smashed the seals, the wax seals get bashed with sticks and things like this. And they have a big bonfire in the middle of the town. Meanwhile, in the countryside, one of the things that happened was that all the court rolls were burned. The court rolls recorded the peasant holdings and the terms that the peasants held their land on. So those were the things that kind of governed their lives. And they also regarded them as instruments of oppression. And the court rolls, hundreds of cases of the court rolls, the manor court rolls, being burned by rebels in the countryside. And so there was a very practical side to it. There's no question about that. But it also went beyond that, because people began to associate writing with their oppressive overlords, and writing itself became a kind of target. There's a famous story of when all these documents had been burned in the middle of Cambridge, and an old lady, as she's called Margaret Sturr, comes along, and she picks up the ashes of the burnt books and throws them in the air. And she says, "Away with the learning of the clerks, away with it." And the learning of the clerks meant writing and documents and all the things that she, presumably not able to read or write, regarded with suspicion. And you can understand why there might be suspicion. And so you have cases like that where they're very definitely, the people opposed to burning manuscripts know what they're going for. But in 1701, I think it was, when there's an attack on the documents in the courts in Naples, there's a large uprising. They go straight for the records of the criminal court and burn them. And they notice the next day that the ashes of the books are much thicker and deeper where the criminal court had been, because that's what the records they want to destroy. They're much deeper than the other things that were burned. So you definitely get that. You definitely get an association of, you can get an association of writing with an oppressive class who are controlling you by this skill, this special skill they have. Yeah?
Yes, exactly. Keeping you out of that skill deliberately and then using that skill against you. You can see why people would be so upset about it and target this so directly in this case, for sure. Many of the examples in your book are from modern history. And of course, this is deliberate. You actually know a lot about medieval history. You chose to go with modern history here. And one of the things that you talk about is the rise of nationalism as having a big part of both the collection and the destruction of these manuscripts. So tell us why nationalism was such an important part of your argument.
I look at 5 case studies of massive destruction of medieval manuscripts that all happened in a few hours. That's what I'm looking at. Obviously, there's attrition all the time. There's flood and fire and mice and all sorts of things eating away at this. But I'm looking at spectacular examples. And they all have 2 things in common, which are connected with nationalism and connected with the state. That is, these collections are a sign that the state is taking the preservation, not the destruction, but the preservation of medieval manuscripts seriously. They create public record offices. They have municipal libraries. They have state archives. All these things are the creation mainly of the period after the French Revolution, the 19th century into the 20th. And so it's the state taking on responsibility. And the European state in this period was nationalistic. It saw itself as a nation state. We are the French, we are the Germans, etc. And that was an impetus to historical inquiry, because they wanted to say, we are going to tell our nation's story. And whatever you think of that, it's very good for getting people to go out and publish and edit and study medieval manuscripts, right? It happened all over. The Germans were in the forefront of it, perhaps because their nation had not had a state for a while, so they wanted to make a big deal about it. And the other thing is, of course, that these destructive moments are to do with war and violence. And in almost every case, there is a nationalist element to the conflict. Sometimes it's very straightforward. It's 2 nations, so on, fighting each other. Sometimes it's more complicated. The Irish case is an obvious one, where you have a struggle over the future of Ireland actually going on within Ireland. The most sort of elaborate of them all, I think, is the destruction of Strasbourg, the municipal library in Strasbourg in 1870, because Strasbourg had been a German city. In 1681, it was annexed by the King of France, Louis XIV of France, so it became French. But it was still culturally very distinct. Lots of German was spoken there. And they were allowed to carry on having Protestant worship in Strasbourg when the rest of France didn't. So it's a very mixed sort of situation. And during the so-called Franco-Prussian War, the Prussian artillery bombard Strasbourg, and they destroy the municipal library. And in it, they destroy this text that I talk about at some length. It's called the Garden of Delights, and it was obviously a very beautiful, hundreds of pages of full-page illustrations, really magnificent. And of course, that was produced in medieval Germany. So the Germans are actually destroying something that is part of their own, as it were, national heritage because of the complexities of this border situation. And so you'll find nationalism of all kinds, both leading people to invest in scholarship and invest in their history. That's a very big development in the 19th and 20th centuries. But also the conflicts are having as a kind of a side effect, particularly with the high level of damage that can be done with modern weapons. That's the crucial thing, I think, why the modern period is so important. Mass destruction of that record as well.
Yes. Well, I think you've given us a good outline of what happens in Strasbourg. And that's the place that I wanted to start next, because your book is not just about destruction, it's also about how we preserve things in the wake of destruction. And this is a really good example, because the destruction of the records in Strasbourg happens in 1870. So this is pre when photography was becoming a thing. I'm not very good with modern history, so I don't know when people started using cameras, but this is pretty early. So how did they reconstruct this book? This is something that you spend some time on in your book. So tell us how they put together what was lost.
Sure. There is photography around in 1870, but it hadn't been applied to this particular volume. And later in the book, I talk about another beautiful example that had been photographed before it was destroyed. That's the Ebsdorf map. But in the case of Strasbourg, we have a lot of evidence of people being really interested in this manuscript, The Garden of Delights. And they do things like they copy out the texts, which are not perhaps the most important part of it. They start from early, I think around about 1815, something like that, very early. They start producing what they can of what we would call reproductions. Now, they can't do it by photography in 1815, but they do it by tracing and then by printing. So they can make many copies of these copies. Lithography is the system of printing they use. And there are some people who are really the heroes by doing this. I mean, obviously, the man whose name you can't forget is Count Bastard. I mean, but he was he was a soldier. He fought and he was very important in the French army. But he then turned his attention to reproductions of medieval manuscripts. And he got a government grant to do it. Some of his reproductions were sent to the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. I mean, he was a really dedicated man to this. And he was one of the people who he taught himself lithography in order to make copies of the images in the Garden of Delights. So you've got this long tradition. And then, of course, in 1870, full stop, there's no chance of making any more drawings or prints or tracings because it's gone. So that's when people begin to say, okay, well, let's gather up what we can from all the people who've looked at it over the past 70 years, 60 or 70 years. So we've got that window of opportunity when there are erudite people interested in the medieval past, studying this, writing about it, and making images from it. And that's what we have. If we actually had the parchment, if we actually had the original, we could do things with it now that are just beyond belief in the 19th century. You know, the chemical analysis that could be done, all these wonderful things that have come along, digitization, photography, and so on. They didn't do that because they didn't have that technology. And that means that's when the ability to reconstruct that volume ends, with the technology available in 1870. And they've done wonderful work. I mean, this is one of the things. I do have good news in the book as well as bad news. I have heroes and heroines who are the people who work very hard to reconstruct in some way or another something that is lost, something that is no longer there. And there is a huge, not life-size exactly, but a very large volume, which is an attempt to reconstruct that particular volume, the Garden of Delights, which was produced for a German nunnery in the late 12th century. And we know that it was commissioned by the Abbess Herad, and inside are pictures of Abbess Herad and all her nuns with all their names written underneath it. It's very charming. It's a very nice thing. And what we see when we look at pictures of that is not a 12th century image, but Count Bastard's work from the 19th century. And you just have to be aware of that. And that's as good as you're going to get. But it's a very, very much a good sight, better than nothing at all.
Well, yes, that's the thing. What's so incredible about this story is people had taken the time to trace the images and to write out what was in the book itself, because this is so rare in itself. The people that were taking the time, because they're handwriting what's in the book before they can even make a facsimile of it. They're handwriting this, taking it home for their notes, for studying. And this is just something that is a 1 in a million shot, maybe not 1 in a million, but still pretty rare. So this is an incredible story, I think.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that the book addresses is the background to it, is the growth of scholarship in the 19th century and the early 20th century. that is addressed to the question of what have we got in terms of physical remains, the manuscripts that are from this period, either from the point of view of the images, as in the case of the Garden of Delights, or in the case of text, which texts have we got? And the work that goes on after the destruction is really a kind of review of the scholars. After the destruction of the State Archives of Naples in 1943, the archivist there, Riccardo Filangieri, he had kept a list of all the people who'd come and worked in the archive for the previous 30 years or 40 years. And he wrote to them all and said, do you have any transcripts? Do you have any copies you've made? And some of them really came up trumps because they had actually hand copied many things from his archive, which he could now publish. And of course, you haven't got the original, but you've got the text. So that's another example.
It's a win. It's a very, very tiny win, but it's still a win.
Yeah, well, it's something, that's what they said. The destruction of the Public Record Office of Ireland in 1922, that has been followed by 100 years of people trying to fill that gap, 100 years. And some of the things they've looked at are transcripts made in the 17th century, transcripts made in the 19th century. You go wherever you can. And maybe sometimes these transcripts aren't very good, but you say, well, what else have you got, right? And that's how it's done. And then, of course, sometimes you have, in the case of Ireland, some of the material was actually duplicated in England because Ireland was under the rule of the King of England. And so some of those documents produced in Ireland are then sent to England for various reasons. So you've got that. And then, of course, sometimes it's very strange because the Public Record Office of Ireland was created in 1867, and this destruction took place in 1922. 3 years earlier, Herbert Wood, who was in charge of the archive, had published an entire volume describing the contents of this Public Record Office, very detailed. So you've got pages and pages and papers, so you know what was in there and you know what was lost. And he's talking about the happy consequences of centralizing the documents, right? And the happy consequences of centralizing the documents was that they could all be blown up in one day. And that's the irony of it. So the lucky documents are the ones that weren't sent to the Public Record Office. It's the ones that missed out on that are more likely to survive. And the same is true of some of the other things. The Ebsdorf map is one of them, which was housed in the State Archive in Hanover. And for most of its existence, the Ebsdorf map, which is it was a huge map of the world. It was 12 feet by 12 feet, right? It's the largest map of the world that we know of from the Middle Ages. Everyone knows, I think everyone knows, many people know of the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which is one animal skin. It's made on one animal skin. It's nice, it's beautiful, it survives. But the Ebsdorf map was 30 animal skins. So, it was huge. And that was kept by the nuns of Ebsdorf, and it had sat around and no one knew anything about it, and it was kind of gathering dust there. And then if it hadn't been sent to Hanover, it would still be there. It would still be intact. It's sent from this place of forgetfulness, but refuge, to a central place. And the central places are the ones that get bombed and shelled and everything. So that's how that worked.
Yes, is the irony. We'll put it in a safe place. It ends up not being the safest place for that.
That's right.
For people who have wandered around the internet or looked at medieval stuff, the Ebsdorf map is the one with Jesus's face at the top that you really see so clearly and his feet at the bottom. This is not the only map in which this happens, but this is the most famous one.
Yeah, it's a remarkable map. And that was photographed. The photography was not very good, but it was photographed. So you've got something like a photographic reproduction of it from the 1890s. The thing that struck me as always as very ironic about all this is that sometimes when war came, sometimes efforts were made to get these things to safe places. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. And Naples is the most ironic, because the State Archive of Naples, which was a very rich archive and a complete run of central documents for the late Middle Ages, that was housed in Naples itself, the city of Naples, which was being bombed by the Allies, by the Americans and the British, because of course the Italians were on the other side. And so they decided to move most of the important medieval documents about 20 or 30 miles away to a villa in the hills nearby for safety. And things were moving very fast. The Italians changed sides. They surrendered, and now the Germans were no longer their allies, they were their enemies, and the German troops were all over Italy. And so suddenly the whole thing has flipped, and German troops come to this villa where the archives are being stored. And it doesn't seem as if they were particularly aiming at the villa, but they burn the villa down and the archive in it. So it's by being put out of Naples into some place, which is meant to be perfectly safe. And suddenly the political situation and the military situation just reverses within a matter of weeks. It's very dramatic. I'm talking about weeks. And of course, that's one of the things that happens there. Or in the case of Chartres. Chartres has, as you know, a very famous cathedral with magnificent stained glass. They put that into crates when the Germans invaded in 1940. They put that into crates. They shipped it several hundred miles away to a cellar in a castle way down south, right? They survived. The books were sent, just like in the case of Naples, the books were sent to a villa about 20 miles away. And that would have they would have been safe there. Except, of course, the German occupation of France continued, and the German authorities seem to have wanted to say, well, things are back to normal now. Okay, you needn't worry. You've got the protection of the German forces. As long as you behave yourself, France needn't worry about destruction. And so the German officers in charge of cultural affairs insisted that all the books go back from that villa into Chartres itself, where they were bombed in the lead up to D-Day in 1944. That's one of these ironies of the situation. That's why you see, I had to put nationalism in there as both a creative and a destructive force, and state power as a destructive and constructive force as well. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the things that was sort of jaw-dropping about the case of Chartres, because you're like, it's fine, it's okay, but then it has to be brought back. And, This is hindsight going, no, but like, honestly, you don't want to put this in a city where it can be vulnerable. And in the case of Chartres, it wasn't the cathedral that was meant to be bombed. It wasn't the archive that was meant to be bombed, but it got bombed anyway. And I think, could see that coming in war,
All the evidence suggests that it was a terrible accident, the bombing of the centre of Chartres. They were sent to bomb the airfield, which would make perfect sense because the landings in Normandy were going to take place in a month or two. And the accounts that you've got are rather contradictory, but they certainly add up to there was a mistake or it was an accident rather than that it was actually intended. But of course, the result is the same, and the medieval manuscripts go up. And there, it just so happens that quite a few of them survive in fragments, charred fragments. There are hundreds and hundreds of fragments. And these have all been digitized and photographed and identified. I mean, it's been an amazing, and it's amazing to think of the sort of labor that's gone into it and the attempt just to sort of save what you can from the past. Fortunately, that was catalogued in the 1890s. So you've got this catalogue which tells you what was there. So you know what was there, and you've got these fragments, and the only thing you haven't got is the real stuff, the actual library. It's gone.
Yes, what a shame. Well, these examples that you have from World War II are surprising in a way. This one that we're talking about now seems to have been accidental, but given the fact that the Nazis were very concerned with preserving cultural heritage so that they could use it for their purposes, it's kind of amazing that so many things were destroyed. But this was a gigantic war. Things are going to be destroyed. But the example you're saying of Naples, this is a deliberate burning of papers, and it seems almost out of character for the regime that we're talking about. So this was not only heartbreaking from a historical perspective, but also a little bit puzzling. It seems like pure revenge, which can be a destructive force all its own.
Yeah, there were hearings about it after the war. And as far as one can work out, the most likely situation is that this was a time when government had more or less broken down in Italy, and the Italian government was now officially had surrendered. The German troops were taking over Italy, so there was a lot of resistance to them. So there was fighting between German troops, not so much between them and the Italian soldiers, but Italian resistance fighters. And there had been attacks on German soldiers in that area, and the Germans had a policy of reprisals. And so the idea was, we'll burn a couple of villas as reprisals for the attacks on German soldiers. And it seems likely that they didn't know that this housed this huge archive. It seems likely that's the case. I'm not quite sure. It's a long time ago. But I mean, yes. And the fog of war, you've heard of the fog of war. This is definitely the fog of war. Yeah,
That's right. You don't want to admit to burning something so important just out of pettiness. I say pettiness. I think you understand what I mean here, but this is obviously existential conflict, but it seems like retribution, I guess, is where I'm trying to go with this. So let's move forward in time to now. So as somebody who's been studying the destruction of manuscripts, reconstruction of manuscripts, what do you see happening now? How are people preserving them?
Well, I think the very big question now, very big, is digitization. And of course, digitization is wonderful. I can go online, and if I'm looking up some text I don't know, it'll come up online, and it'll say, would you like to see a manuscript? And I'll say, yes. So the next thing I know, I'm looking at a manuscript in Valenciennes or something like that. Of course, the downside is I haven't got an excuse to go to Valenciennes and so on. So your research trips are much more limited than they are otherwise. But you can go very quickly to an array of source material, an array of manuscript material that is just, it would have been unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago. And it's continuing. And I suppose the big issue that everyone thinks about is, how permanent can the storage be? Is digitization forever? Is the technology going to remain exactly the same? If the technology changes, are things going to get lost and be irretrievable? There's a famous example, which is in 1986, which is the centenary of Domesday Book, which was made in 1086. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, decided to kind of have a modern Domesday Book. And they did a survey of the whole country, and they put all the data in, and they put it on a particular system, a storage system. And that was kind of like going to be our own Domesday Book. Unfortunately, within 10 years, that retrieval system was completely obsolete and no longer functioned. And that material is inaccessible. And it's as if it had never been. And that's a kind of extreme example. And maybe some of the problems for then are not the problems we have now. But that's where you really got to sort of think of, how safe is this? How precarious is it? I mean, a long-term imaging, it's expensive. You've got to have the right technology. That's one of the things I thought would be really big now. Though, of course, old-fashioned wars, they still can, pack a punch. Mm-hmm. When Timbuktu was taken over by Islamists a few years ago, lots of stuff in the Timbuktu library disappeared. And the Timbuktu library is a very important reservoir of medieval Islamic writing. So there's still dangers of that still can happen. But I think that we can be relatively positive and hopeful that the technology for storing and reproducing manuscripts is now at a stage where, if you can do it, then the chances are you've preserved that, not simply in terms of having a copy of it for the future, but making it accessible to anybody with a laptop or whatever, I mean, that's astonishing. That's just astonishing.
Yes. Well, and one of the things that is happening, I just wanted to get your take on, and you don't talk about it in the book, is people are creating facsimiles now, and they will sell facsimiles of an amazing book. What do you think about that? Is this a good way to access the past, or do you prefer digital images?
Well, I prefer digital images because they're much cheaper, of course. You can,
that is true.
Facsimiles are pretty expensive. It's nice. It's nice to have a facsimile, and you can browse to it and so on. The most expensive book I've ever bought is not a facsimile of a medieval manuscript, but a facsimile of a medieval manuscript, which is the Hortus Deliciarum, the Garden of Delights, with Count Bastard's lithographic prints. I bought that. And that was the most expensive book I've ever bought. So I do have my weaknesses. But I think really, for practical purposes, digitization is the thing, isn't it? And also, of course, it's much easier to magnify the image and things like that. It's the way of the future, I think.
Yes.
I still think there'll be people going and looking at medieval manuscripts and medieval archives and getting their magnifying glass out and saying, is that a C or is it a T? I think these things will still happen.
Yes. And in fact, they're encouraged. People who are archivists and librarians are encouraging people to come and look at these manuscripts because they are meant to be looked at. They are meant to be moved and touched. And if they're not, then that is damage in its own right.
And also there's the smell. I think the smell of medieval parchment is very distinctive. It's very exciting. I always remember the very first time I saw a medieval manuscript in real life many years ago when the British Library was still part of the British Museum. And I remember two things about it. One was I was looking at the pattern on the skin on the actual sheet and the little dots, which is where the hair follicles of the animal were. So I thought this is a calf or something that lived 800 years ago, and here's the follicles. And the other one was the smell. So, of course, you can reproduce the follicles online, but the smell, I think they haven't got round to that yet.
Yes.
Maybe that's the next stage.
Yes, that's what we need in that tactile sense of turning the pages because they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
It feels much different from paper, but the follicles, of course, that's what speaks to all of us, I think. That and the dirt.
And the dirt, indeed.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here and telling us all about these examples of manuscripts that were preserved and destroyed, because I think this is a conversation that needs to keep happening. And I'm very grateful that you've come on to remind us to look at this every once in a while, because this is such an important part of our history. So thank you so much for being here.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
To find out more about Robert's work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of St. Andrews, or you can find him on Wikipedia. His new book is History in Flames: The Destruction and Survival of Medieval Manuscripts. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. So if you find yourself in Venice, and I'm sure you want to be.
Sure, yes.
You will want to take a look at that statue of a bronze-winged lion that's like at St. Mark's.
Okay.
It's basically the symbol of like the Venetian Republic.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that statue is actually Chinese.
Whoa. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised because there is a lot of trade happening between the Far East and Venice at this time. But tell us all about it.
Yeah. So a few researchers did the scientific tests and confirmed that the stone is actually from China. And the best part of this, it's likely a tombstone from the Tang Dynasty.
Whoa.
And it was likely brought to Venice by Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, the father and uncle of Marco Polo.
Wow. I mean, that would just be totally neat, right? All wrapped up in a nice shiny bow.
They think while they were in Beijing from 1264 to 68, they figure that they may have went into like a warehouse where these Tang Dynasty tombstones were being kept, because it was at a time when these tombstones were getting taken away from their original spots. And they had it shipped to Venice, got put on a nice pedestal, and a few things have been added, like the wings, over the years.
Okay, so it was originally a lion without wings.
Yes.
And then it got glammed up once it got to Venice?
Yes, pretty much. It got glammed up. It's like there's bits and pieces that have, over the years, had to be redone.
Wow. Well, that is a super interesting bit of news. Awesome.
Indeed. Yeah, I thought that was a lot of fun. And we have kind of a similar piece. Is Thomas Smith is writing for the first time on Medievalist.net, and he is telling us the story of why a Chinese sword can be found on a crusader's effigy that's sitting in New York.
I love this. And Tom is so great. I'm so glad that he's getting articles on Medievalist.net so that more people can see his work.
It was so nice, so easy to put his piece online. So thank you very much, Thomas. Very good work there.
Anything else for us this week?
Yeah, and beyond that, we have a few other news stories. One that was interesting, a new Viking hairstyle was found, courtesy of a 1,000-year-old gaming piece.
I love that. When a new Viking hairstyle drops on the internet.
Yes. It looks kind of like a wavy hair, kind of like a 1970s look. So.
Oh, nice.
So we have all that and much, much more on Medievalist.net this week.
Well, thank you, Peter, for stopping by and letting us know.
Thanks.
It's last call from my online class, Calamity and Change, an Introduction to the 14th Century, which starts this Friday, September 12th. Every week for 5 weeks, we'll talk about the ins and outs of 14th century life and I'll answer all your burning questions about this period. And for the next day or two, the back to school sale is still on, so you can get 15% off with the coupon code BACKTOSCHOOL, all one word. You can find it all at medievalstudies.thinkific.com. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Finally, a big thank you, as always, to all of you for supporting my work by listening, sharing, letting the ads play through, or becoming patrons on patreon.com. Patrons are everyday heroes because without you, none of this would be possible. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from flames to dames, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an awesome day.